Please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. But first, if everyone can turn on their mics, I think that would be helpful. Is the speaker mic on?
Yeah, I just put it on.
There you go. Okay, we have a double meeting tonight. The microphones seem to be high. We'll consider the applications. First, routine applications.
Okay.
Call upon the clerk.
Okay, Mr. Chairman. The first application is SE8 from the Department of the First Selectman. The purpose of this application is to add an additional $25,000 appropriation for the settlement of litigation, Sherry versus Home. I'd like to move that.
Second.
Thank you.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino, second by Ms. Barton. Discussion.
This is a routine litigation settlement. The settlement was approved by the Law Committee by a vote of 2-0 on February 16th and by the Budget Committee 4-0 on March 9th. The proposed settlement was discussed with the Law Department at both meetings. It is a settlement of a personal injury case and workers' compensation claim in the amount of $25,000.
Further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? 12-0-0.
Mr. Chairman, the second application that comes before us this evening is SE9 from the Department of the First Selectman. This is a request for emergency appropriation of $600,000 for the purpose of the storm cleanup. I'd like to move that.
It's moved by Mr. Pellegrino, second by Mr. Mason. Dustin, are you here to speak on that item, or is anybody from the First Selectman's office?
I would speak on that item.
Okay.
But I can say that every available crew that's been available to be leveraged in an effort to ameliorate the devastation visited upon Greenwich, unfortunately, has been. So the transfer station has been open, extended hours of the transfer station will begin on Saturday. Overtime has been allocated where overtime is available, so $600,000 would be very useful. And I'm sure they have things to say also.
Okay.
Who's going to say something?
We got some estimates from fire, police, Parks and Rec.
That would be helpful.
Their estimates are about $400,000.
Sorry?
That's $400,000
Total.
total.
As of when and projected for how far?
For another week or so.
Roland, oh, I'm sorry.
Mr. Finger.
You said that was Parks and Rec, Police and Fire?
Yes.
Anything from DPW?
Not yet.
Or please.
Mr. Chairman?
Okay, yeah, and if you could raise your hands, it's hard for me to always see. I can see Mr. Kelly and Mr. Huffman, so maybe the two of you also
We have nothing.
can help me in this directly. I will try to get everybody and be able to get everyone. So Mr. Campbell and then Ms. Barton.
Can we have a sense whether it's from you, Roland, or Peter, or Dustin? You give us department totals, but what is the money being spent on? Is it mostly for human resources, for overtime? Is it?
In the case of fire, a good part of that is vehicle damage.
Sorry?
For what?
Back up to the beginning. Do you remember the nor'easter and then the ice storm in January, and the nor'easter in April a couple of years ago? When the area is declared a disaster area, in this case Greenwich and Stamford, I think at a minimum were declared a disaster area, you're eligible for FEMA reimbursements. FEMA reimbursements are usually 75% of eligible cost. What happens is, in the previous examples, like the whole state or a whole area was was declared a disaster area, they would call you in and give you an educational class, and I went to both of them in the case of, one was in Stratford Town Hall, one was in Monroe Town Hall, and they educate you on what is eligible. The obvious ones are extra police or fire or public works or any personnel that are called in on an overtime basis or a straight time basis to clean up for the storm. There's other costs that become eligible, like generators, if you have to call in tree crews, if it's in case of snow, it'd be independent contractors remove snow, et cetera, et cetera. So to answer your question, they have to give you the guidelines on what is eligible. In this case, it has to be directly related to the cleanup of the trees. It could also be, for example, if there's flooding in schools, if roof damage to buildings, anything that's associated with the storm. One of the requirements is you have to have real good records, and they will audit them. And one of the reasons we wanted to create this account was to have all the costs in this one account instead of going through all the overtime accounts in the police department and the fire department, and have all the backup sitting and waiting for them when they come for the audit. That's the reason for the creation of the account. And to answer your question, we won't know, except for the obvious ones, which are eligible. And we usually get 75%. Now, added on to that, I called the Franklin Company, and we had a claims adjuster go up to the golf course. Some of the golf course will probably be covered through insurances. So we can get the amounts that we don't get, the deductibles for the insurance of the golf course, we could pick up and resubmit on the FEMA side or vice versa.
So I appreciate we're looking to get as much of this money back. I just, we didn't have obviously any itemized list. We're just asked for $600,000. So I just wanted to get a sense, is it a majority of those funds are for overtime for personnel? I mean, how is that allocated?
It was a guess. It was an absolute guess. I talked with John Crary. We said, let's just arbitrarily go for $500,000. I figured the BET would ask the question tonight. So I went to Dan Warzo and I said, try to help me with this. Is $500,000 a good number? He started rattling off, like Justin just started, Dustin, I'm sorry, started to say overtime here and generators and this and that. He came up with $600,000, but I think what we need is we need further research. This could just be a small amount as far as what it's actually going to cost in the end. What this does is it helps us. It sets up an account so we have an account to charge to, and we could start gathering the data, and then we could refine it in May, and then when we have a final number, we can go to the RTM for the full appropriation. So this is just really step one, and it's really a guess, the $600,000.
Dustin, did you?
Want me to step up or-
Sure, no, if you can, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Just to emphasize the point that Mr. Medarski made, this is step one. It's the preliminary damage assessment phase and recapturing federal funds. It is a guess. It's back in the napkin. You send it, and then FEMA will make a determination if it's a federal disaster. And that's why there will be a tree by tree. That's the granular level of detail that we've been keeping records. So it's there, and when it comes time to submit that final submission to FEMA, of course, it'll be made available to you. So I just wanted to make sure that you understood that it's granularly detailed.
Ms. Barton?
I'm hoping this mic is on. We don't have anything to tell us one way or the other. I don't have any objection to transferring money to a separate account to track for FEMA purposes how much the town is spending on town cleanup and to make whatever is the appropriate claim to FEMA. I think that's the responsible thing to do. But I have a couple of questions. One is, the newspapers have reported town officials as saying that the damage is in excess of $1 million. The request is for $600,000. Now, yeah, we can do some now and some later, but I don't understand the reason for the discrepancy. Secondly, I question, and I know there are others on this panel that disagree, I question taking the money from the risk fund, which is our litigation settlement fund, and allocating it to something that properly should come out of a contingency which we did not establish last year. And as those of you with long memories will recall, I advocated the establishment of about $1 million of contingency last year. So my personal preference, which may not carry the day, would be to charge the contingency fund, which currently has a balance of 0, for whatever we need, and that will reduce fund balance going into next year's budget, which that's the way it goes, but that's the way I think these kinds of things should be handled. This is not a litigation risk, it is a contingency risk.
Mr. Pellegrino and then Mr. Raymer.
Well, I was not going to follow up on Nancy's comments, so if somebody does, I wanted to ask a question. So, Mr. Chairman, what would you prefer?
Go ahead, ask a question. I mean,
Yeah, is there a limitation on time by which we need to submit our claims to FEMA?
The preliminary damage assessment is due on Monday,
This coming Monday?
the 22nd.
Okay. And after Monday, what opportunity do we have to go back to FEMA to submit additional claims should we determine that there is additional cost?
It's wide open. Monday is the preliminary damage assessment, and then if it meets the threshold that they're looking for, I'm sorry, I don't know the threshold that they're
Okay.
looking for in this case. There will be opportunities to work with FEMA. They will come, they'll send site inspectors, and that's when you can add and add and add.
Okay. Second question to Mr. Minarski. From your experience, what should we expect to be the total amount of time before we actually have a final resolution as to the cost of this storm?
It would be months.
Months.
At a minimum, months. First of all, just
Yeah.
answer your question and go back to try to answer Nancy's first question.
Please.
The police and the fire and public works all have currently overtime accounts. What they're going to do is charge their salary accounts now, okay? But they're probably going to run out of money at some point in time. What this does is we set up the $600,000, then come up with a final number. We'll JV the eligible cost out of the overtime accounts and charge it into this account so that they're not coming back to the BET and the RTM to replenish their overtime accounts.
Okay.
And does that help you on the first question you asked
That makes
before?
an enormous amount of sense. I
So-
don't have any problem creating the account.
Yeah. Now, there are vendors that they're going to hire, and like tree crews, independent tree crews, where right now they won't have the money or enough of the money appropriated, so they need an account to charge it to. Otherwise, the accounts payable in finance won't pay the bills. And we can't exceed the appropriate control of commitments, Mr. Mason's favorite topic. We need a place to charge it.
Okay.
I'm perfectly okay with the new account.
If I,
Mr. Pellegrino.
Mr. Chairman, if I heard you clearly, we have used our best efforts, talked to all the responsible people to arrive at this estimate of the 600,000. The number that Ms. Barton says that was in the paper, we don't have control over that number.
I can't comment on it. I don't even know who the officials are. They're
It
quoting.
may not be a town expense, that could be
Okay.
everybody's expense.
Here
Thank
comes
you,
someone
Mr.
who
Chairman.
might
Sure.
know.
Mr. Raymer and then Ms. Tarkington and then Mr. Norton.
Mine was really a question for the chair. I wonder if it would not be appropriate to have there be a condition on this appropriation for it subject to release when they've accounted to us in the several months' time as to what the funds were needed for before these funds are used to reimburse the overtime accounts of the various departments that were listed to us.
I don't think it's customary that we put subjects to on interim appropriations, but I don't think there's anything in the charter that prohibits us from doing it.
I feel somehow that this is a $600,000 appropriation, which, for obvious reasons, nobody's accounting to us yet what it's needed for, and I feel somehow that we have a responsibility to see what the funds have been used for before the funds are released for reimbursement of those accounts.
Well, let me say this then. So, obviously, we're not going to meet again until April. Do you think you'll need any of this money before then? Because if not, Mr. Raymer, then you're talking about a special meeting, which we
No,
might want to
no.
do anyway. But if we're talking about a month, then I think what we can simply do is direct the comptroller to keep us in the loop and give us a monthly report, whether it's through the first selectman's office or through the comptroller, to give us that accounting. So I don't.
Before the funds are released, because we're being asked to approve the allocation of these funds today, you see.
That's right, and so that's why I'm asking if they need the funds before our next meeting.
So I'd be interested in the answer to that question, too.
I take the comment.
You have a comment, Mr. Simon, on that particular issue?
Yeah, I think you need to You don't necessarily need the funds to pay the departments for overtime, but you need to have money in this account to hire external entities like tree crews or somebody. Otherwise, you can't go to a contract. You have to have some money
We started
there.
spending money last Saturday. So we are going to be billed within any day now, and it's going to be accruing because they've been out there for.
But you're going to be billed for
Non-payroll.
non-departmental costs.
But this has to go to the RTM, correct? Or no? Under the, under,
Yes, yes.
Ultimately, I think you have some history with Captain's Island.
The Great Captain's Island went to the RTM, and when we had a storm 2 years ago, that also went to the RTM.
But it went
After the fact.
After the fact.
Spending was already submitted as backup.
Because it was on-
well, so you're not going to be able to use this money until the RTM votes on it in, what, April?
March.
March is passed.
But I don't think that's
No,
true.
it's
March
going to
is-
be June.
Why?
They won't take it, they won't take it in, when you're ready, it won't be ready in April, if you don't vote on it.
I guess March is not, doesn't come on.
Wait, hold on. Let me back up.
But I was.
If we approve this today, with or without Mr. Raymer's subject to release, you're gonna attempt to get it on the April RTM agenda? The deadline hasn't passed, I don't think. Tomorrow's the deadline. Okay.
Are you going to have a hard number for the RTM in April?
We'll have better numbers to today, but we certainly won't, we won't have a complete calculation by April. We'll still be.
I would prefer and suggest it goes to RTM in June.
Yeah, but
Well, I'll let you, I mean, that's between the two of, I really think the comptroller then should talk with the first selectman's office to figure out how to handle this. But to Mr. Raymer's point, so this will go before the RTM, whether it's April or June. And if you want a report, I don't see how a subject to release would slow it down because they can't use the money until the RTM votes anyway,
I don't think
officially.
that's correct. I think you're going to pay bills starting next week.
Yeah.
The last time this went to the RTM, all of the bills were paid.
Because it's an emergency.
Because it's an emergency.
It's an emergency.
But Mr. Raymer, you're looking to stop that until there's an accounting?
Well, maybe we could separate two sums then. I mean, I don't want to make this more complicated than necessary, but maybe if, with the aid of the controller, we could get an estimate of what's needed to deal with the current expenditures. Maybe we could allocate that now, appropriate that now, and take the remainder, the sum which is going to be used for reimbursement of overtime expenses of the various departments that the controller was indicating to us, and maybe we could hold a subject to release on that, and before these funds supplement their budgets, we could hear what was spent and what it was spent for, and then we can approve it and release the funds at that time.
And so, Mr. Raymer, while the discussion continues, if you could then draft your subject to release, and then when it's appropriate, I'll let you make that amendment to it.
It would assist me if the controller could give me an estimate of how much is needed for the ready funds and how much would be needed for the later reimbursement funds, because I don't have those figures.
Steve, Mr. Chairman?
The biggest piece is missing, which is public works, unless John or Dustin has an update. It's too early, we can't give an estimate.
No, that's
You know,
not.
Mr. Chairman?
I appreciate the urgency of the moment. It just seems somehow a little irresponsible to appropriate $600,000. It's a fairly sizable sum, and we really have no accounting, no idea, no expression. We're told it's a guess. And I want to be cooperative with the departments that we're asking to do an emergency relief, but I don't want to be irresponsible about our own financial responsibilities here. And I'd be grateful if one of my colleagues helps me achieve a balance on that, where I seem to be having difficulty doing so.
I'll make a comment on that, too.
Okay. Anybody? I was going to call on Ms. Tarkington next, but we'll take up this particular item or segment. We'll call it sort of the Raymer issue.
Sorry.
And so if you want to talk about that issue, let me know, and we'll address it and then move on. Mr. Norton, and then Mr. Simon, and then Mr. Kelly.
I think that putting any conditions on the release of this is not good policy at this point in time, because we don't know how much money is going to be involved. And it seems to me that some of these outside contractors whom we're hiring and also paying dump fees and other expenses are an immediate expense. And the question I have also to the First Selectman's office, the initial request to FEMA, which I think is next week, the lack of an appropriation, does that impede it in any way? No. But, okay, back to my original point. I don't like any subject to release conditions on this. This is an emergency situation, and actually, I think it really is covered under Section 28 of the Charter. And I think under those conditions, I don't think we should be putting any subject to release conditions on this.
Mr. Minarski.
Just one final comment. Let me just, maybe I misled a little bit. This is strictly a collection account for accounting purposes, so that when we go to FEMA, we've got all of these expenses in one collection account, as opposed to 6 or 7 different fire overtime accounts, 6 or 7 police overtime accounts, 15, 20 public works accounts. So it's really it's a collection of expenses strictly for the storm and nothing else, with the backup application to FEMA to be reimbursed. I made it unclear.
Why do
But
you
that's-
need a motion?
Hold on. That's okay.
And then there's
I'm
the
just trying to
charter.
keep some semblance of.
Well, the charter gives you the authority under Section 28 to do this.
Right, exactly.
But why do we have to?
Mr. Chairman?
All right, so we're going to stay on Mr. Raymer's topic, and then we'll head back. Mr. Simon, do you still have
Yes?
you have the floor.
So if we have to put a dollar amount in, I would release $250,000. You need to release money for non-town entities. That should be enough, unless you think that's not enough. Are you planning to hire more than $250,000 of entities outside of the town of Greenwich?
I wouldn't think so, but we haven't gathered the data yet. The department heads have been asked to have everything in by Monday for expenses including this weekend. Expenses include right up to 8 a.m. Monday morning. We're gathering this for FEMA submission. I don't anticipate those expenses to be above 250, but it's a really rough estimate at this time.
All right.
Departments are not in the mode of putting together
Okay.
the numbers that you're looking for. We're still in the cleanup, restoration mode.
Mr. Geiger.
In terms of outside contractors, Parks and Rec estimates they're gonna spend about $120,000 just on be doing the beaches and free from outsourcing. So that's sort of going on, depending on when they want to get the beaches ready for the summer, they could be spending that fairly soon.
I'm going to go, all right. I think, from my point of view with Mr. Raymer's comments, I think that the town will be adequately protected, that we will know what the money is being spent for. I think, to Mr. Minarski's comment about Mr. Raymer's comment, we are releasing $600,000 of additional money. This account, although it does collect the money in one place, we are releasing $600,000 of money that people can spend. So it's not just a collection account. So, but I think, listening to this discussion, I would not support the contingency, because we'll have an accounting. They're only going to release money that they think is appropriate for the storm. We have a relatively competent finance department that I have full faith in, and, we'll proceed from there.
Mr. Kelly.
I would echo Mr. Simon's comments. I would not support a subject to release. I appreciate Mr. Raymer's concerns, and I certainly want a full accounting at the end as to what the $600,000, how it was allocated, how it was spent. But I'm sure Mr. Minarski and Mr. Geiger will give that to us. We'll request it. And I think that satisfies our obligations with respect to approving this appropriation. So,
Anybody on the Raymer issue only, and then if not, Raymer issue? Mr. Campbell.
Just to put a fine point on it, do I understand that most of the money has been spent?
No.
I mean, aren't you talking about expenses that have been incurred,
right.
not necessarily to be incurred?
There's both. There's a lot of labor that's been expended, and as Roland just said, there's going to be a lot of
There'll
cleanup
be
at the
some.
beaches, et
So
cetera.
just to clarify, I mean, you weren't waiting for this meeting. The first selectman wasn't waiting for this meeting to go order emergency services to be expended and to do a job that has to be done in Greenwich. So, much of this has already happened, and we're simply being asked to bless it, and I think we should.
Bless it and account for it at the end.
Ms. Spartan, are you on this issue?
The Raymer issue, no.
Okay. Okay, then we're gonna go back to the other list. It'll go as follows. I have Ms. Tarkington, Mr. Norton, Ms. Barton, and then Mr. Mason still to speak. So, Ms. Tarkington?
Yes, may I ask a question for you of either Mr. Minarski or our town administrators? Will property owners also be able to apply under this program? Is that what increases the cost of the overall, if this is approved as a federal program?
FEMA program?
Yes, the FEMA program.
Certainly.
So property owners will be applying also, and there will be appropriate notice on the town website or elsewhere on how to do this?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Norton?
But can I just, is there any estimate at all compared to the town costs, what these might be?
Not really. FEMA will be here in the next 2 weeks to do an evaluation, and they'll be gathering data from all of our regions here for the county. So it'll be weeks before we have to even good estimates.
Thank you.
Mr. Norton?
I have two questions, one for the controller and one for the Board of Selectmen. What would be expected payment from FEMA once they approve something? How long will it take for them to reimburse us?
At this time, I do not know.
What is norm in this type situation?
The last time I was involved in these 20 years ago.
I've done a few of these. What FEMA does is, not necessarily in the case of labor, say for example there's damage to the shore, the towns will submit claims. They'll come down and try to figure out if they're pre-existing. So we might submit $2 million worth of claims and only get paid 75% of $1 million. So there's no way right now, at this point, it's still too early, to try to put an estimate on how much we're going to submit or get reimbursed.
No, I'm not trying to do that, Peter. What I'm trying to do is identify how long it will take the government, FEMA, to reimburse us.
I think when we had the storm March, April, we got it in the fall, the last
Okay.
time, 6 months.
All right, which gets to my second point, is why you're suggesting or recommending basically this go on the RTM for June. Don't we need expenses to be paid within the next 30 to 60 days, especially with the tree crews? It seems to me that this should be on the April RTM call. And why are you suggesting a time subsequent to that?
I'm going to defer to the First Selectman's office because they're going to be asking hard questions about how much it's going to cost, and I don't think you're going to have hard numbers in for the call in the next couple of weeks, right?
We'll have some, but I don't know if we'll have enough to, hard numbers in your case. So I suspect it's going to be well in excess of 600,000, but at this time I do not know. We don't have good enough numbers to even make a good estimate.
But it seems to me that the members of the RTM are not going to really object.
I wouldn't think so either. I have no problem at all bringing it to the RTM. So if you approve it tonight, we'll get it right on there tomorrow, and it'll be there in April. We'll support it. We think 600,000 is not an unreasonable number. We think we're going to spend more than 600,000. We think we ought to go for it. If we don't, we'll wait for June.
Yeah,
We have no problem.
those are my points, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Barton?
I'll go back to my question about first, why we're taking this out of the litigation risk fund, which we need for other purposes. And secondly, if we have the money in the departments, and they can and presumably have committed the expenses, some can argue that there haven't been enough expenses committed, but that's a discussion for another day, or maybe another hour. What are we being asked to do, and why is it important? I have no problem consolidating the expenses in a single account to keep track of them. I think that makes eminently good sense. But why do we have to transfer money from one place to another place in order to keep track of money that we're already spending, that is supposedly within our existing budget? This is not an additional appropriation. This is a transfer.
I'll try to answer. If you spent the money in the general fund, and let's say that it ends up as $2.5 million total, you would have a $2.5 million hit to the fund balance in the general fund in this year.
Right.
and you wouldn't get the revenues till next year, and it wouldn't be recouped into another year. So the balance sheet will show the fund balance at 2.5 less if you use the general fund. Negative.
Yeah, no, I understand that. That's because we did not appropriate a contingency last year. But, you know, that's where we are. So I just don't understand what we're being asked to do, why it is so important that we do it today, and what the dollar amount is expected to be.
Hold on, Mr. Malinowski, first to say, so the sheet says it's an additional appropriation.
What is it, says additional, right?
It says additional appropriation.
This is an
Which this is,
additional
correct?
appropriation.
No, but it has a from. It says from risk fund balance.
Well, let's start with the
transfer.
first point.
Is it an additional appropriation?
It's
No, it's
freeing
not.
up money under the same process that you approve litigation, plain settlements.
It's a
So-
yes, that's a yes/no question.
So it's coming from fund balance. It has the effect of being an additional appropriation, yes.
Okay, just like the one above.
Same impact.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And so this would come from, right now, it currently constituted to come from the risk fund.
That's what we would spend in the risk fund.
And that's what we did with the Island Beach storm.
Well,
I didn't hear the answer to that question.
we didn't answer.
There
that.
isn't one.
I don't think about the capital non-recurring.
Okay.
I'd like to comment on that.
Hold on. Mr. Mason, and then Mr. Simon.
Okay, let's back up here. We're looking at what I don't think are the proper things to look at. Funding, where the funding is coming from is an internal decision later on. If you were to have to backfill the departments because of, under section 30, they can't overspend their allocations. We would have to have a blue sheet for Parks and Rec for this, for the police department for that, for the first selectman's office for this, for this. That's not what we're doing. All we're doing is allowing an expenditure, and we're being asked for $600,000. So we are authorizing a level of spending without it being in a particular department or major object code. We're just saying, set up a separate account. Here's an authorization to spend $600,000. That is all we are being asked to do. Nothing else. We're not being asked where it comes from. And I know the blue sheet, and I respect that, says from the risk fund. That, to me, is Peter Minarski's decision where and how we fund this. It'll obviously come back to us if it's something in the next budget. But my point is, whether we use uncommitted funds in other departments to cover this at the end of the fiscal year, our choice, Peter's choice. But all we are being asked to do is say it's okay to the town to spend $600,000 towards this storm and then have each department draw from it as they need to, and we need a reconciliation on it at some time. It's really nothing more, it's that simple. It's not complicated. It's not where the money's coming from. It's just, we couldn't sit here and do interim appropriations for every department. We'd have to go into Parks and Rec and fill salary accounts, and we'd have to fill the 300 for outside contractors. We'd have to go into the office of the first selectman and backfill. That we can't do. So that's why there's a process under emergencies, under section 28 of the charter, to allow us to just take it, set up a separate account. It doesn't have major object codes. It's just, it's an amount to draw from for covering these emergency. And it's really that simple.
Mr. Simon?
So, I just want to make sure that, to Mr. Mason's point, and I'll go back to Ms. Barton's point, that we are actually adding $600,000 additional appropriation to the budget that we already passed.
Yes.
Two, the risk fund doesn't have the word litigation in front of it. You keep adding that. You've only been here when it's been used for litigation, but it is truly, in fact, a town risk fund. This, I believe, is a risk the town has incurred. I think this is an appropriate use of the money. One of the things we think about in the town as we reduce the contingency is we put money into a risk fund, we have money in a capital non-recurring balance, and this is, I believe, an appropriate use of this money, and this is where I would recommend it to come from. I would be very much opposed to creating on our balance sheet a negative fund balance when it's not necessary.
Mr. Raymer?
I don't want to get back to the Raymer memorandum before,
But you will. Excellent.
But I'm intrigued with Mr. Mason's point that they'll come back and there'll be a reconciliation. I guess I'm not understanding how and when that reconciliation takes place with the BET. I'm not sure there is a reconciliation with the BET. I understand, and I have the same confidence in the Controller's Office as our chair does, and I assume the Controller's Office would see there isn't a misuse or misapplication of funds. But I am listening carefully to distinguished Mr. Mason here talking about there being a reconciliation of these accounts with the BET, and I'm not sure that's going to happen.
No, well, okay.
Real quick, if you put a subject to release on it, and it's already been committed, if they've hired tree crews and hired whatever they've done, your subject to release means nothing because they've committed on behalf of the town.
I yield on the point of the subject to release. I didn't hear a rejoinder from a single member of this panel. I yield on that point. Where my interest is at this point is to understand exactly what reconciliation is going to take place with or without a subject to release. I'm reluctant to devote an extra $600,000 to the overtime accounts of the departments when it was not our decision to apply those funds at the outset, and there doesn't seem to be a process by which these departments are going to account to us, meaning the BET, for how those funds were spent after the fact.
The reconciliation process will be when FEMA audits the books, and any funds that are disallowed are going to be charged back to the departments as unallowable. And then, if they've overcharged their accounts, like padding expenses or whatever, then they have to come to the BET and ask for additional monies in June. I think that is the control, the oversight as far as the reconciliation
Of course, the FEMA will pay only 75%. So
of eligible costs.
Yeah.
They're going to audit our records.
My understanding, too, is the Office of the First Selectman will also be reviewing these in the context of ensuring that all storm-related costs, as opposed to maybe some desires of departments, should there be any, to do some other work.
Or have pre-existing conditions.
Yeah, that's very good.
Poor John.
that finally brought John to the microphone.
John has to
Absolutely.
stand.
No, we're not going to look at, we do not view this as a windfall. Now let's take advantage of this emergency to get everything else we want to get done.
Great
This is,
plan, John.
we're going to identify specifically the costs we incur. These we have to submit to FEMA. They're not going to be, wild fancies that we put together. There's specific costs. There'll be clearly overtime this week, next week, probably for a couple more weeks. Those are clearly going to be on this particular project. There's going to be vendors we've hired, brought in with equipment and personnel to do cleanup, to move things around that we have to get done, to repair things. Those will all be submitted to FEMA, and they'll also go against whatever the account that you established. There's going to be extra expenses. We know already we've used a considerable amount of money on fuel, diesel, gasoline, trucks driving all over the place. That we're way over what we normally would spend during a 5-day period. Just tremendous. So we're going to be tracking all of those things, and those will be submitted to the Controller's Office to be charged against this account, and that's all it is. Nothing more. It's not. We're not trying to. There will not be any attempt on our part, I can assure you, to try to pull any subterfuge.
Hold on, Ms. Tarkington, and then we'll go from there.
My view on this is the setting up this account should be done immediately. Having, sat on the Nathaniel Witherall board and relying on federal and state funding for the reimbursement of the, room revenues, keeping all the document in place, making sure you're accounting for everything on day one, retaining that documentation is a tremendous record-keeping job. I guess if I have a concern about this is that we're waiting until now to set up this account, that we didn't have a special meeting earlier this week to make sure that the account was in place so that we didn't lose track of any piece of documentation and any opportunity to get reimbursement for FEMA. So, I think the sooner we can set up the account, keep things centrally focused, the better off the town will be in terms of reimbursement.
Mr. Norton.
Yeah, to the controller, who's the acting risk manager, Peter, have you, are you identifying any potential costs that can be reimbursed to our various insurance coverages?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I was working with Mr. DeAndrea. You had a claims adjuster up there today?
Other than that, you mentioned that earlier, but how about the?
There's a lot of them, we have very high deductibles in certain areas, and there has to be a determination if it was caused by flooding or if it was caused by wind, and whether you're in a 50-year flood zone as opposed to a 100-year flood zone, you need insurance adjusters and experts to come in. I've already started the process. It started on Monday. I've been in contact with Frankel every day, and like I said, the claims adjuster happened to be in town because of the activity in Westchester and Stamford and Greenwich. We're looking at all types of reimbursement, whether it's FEMA or insurance.
So part of the reconciliation does involve the insurance
Yes.
requirements?
Yes.
That was the point.
Mr. Kelly,
Could I move the question?
please.
I move the question.
It's been moved.
What is the question?
Approval of $600,000.
To move $600,000 from the risk fund to this new fund?
Yes. It's been moved by Mr. Pellegrino, second by Mr. Mason. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? 11-1-0.
I'd like to make sure that the record is clear that I do not oppose the spending of whatever money is necessary to ensure that our neighborhoods are repaired. I think it's appropriate that we segregate the funds so that we can get maximum FEMA reimbursement. I am opposed to subtracting that amount from the risk fund instead of stepping up to the plate and taking it from where we should take it. That's the only reason for my negative vote. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Moving right along, item 3, the assessor's report. Good evening. Our assessor, Ed Gortney, here with Assistant Assessor Bob Shipman.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. The Board of Assessment Appeals concluded their hearings and have made their decisions. And I can report that they made reductions. There were 277 cases. They made reductions on 38. The total amount of their reductions was $22,736,000, which is about 6 1/1000ths of 1%. It's a very small amount. In terms of our elderly tax credits, we've to date received 218 applications for the elderly tax credit. We've had 5 inquiries about the deferral program, but no applications have been submitted there yet. You have my report. I'll be glad to answer any questions that you have.
Ms. Tarkington.
Yes, I have a couple questions for Mr. Gortney. The first is, there's no sales report attached here, which we've been seeing on a regular basis in terms of residential sales. I was wondering if either you have the information on the February sales, or if you don't, if you could attach a report to next month's report. Attach, the sales information, including the most recent couple months to next month's report.
I'll give you a report at next monthly meeting on sales.
Okay, great. And then I also had a question on your point number 9, the income and expense reports. It said that you're requiring these reports to be returned 1 month earlier. Is this sort of notice on the town website, or should you put some kind of notice in the paper to make sure that people are aware that this information is due 1 month earlier in order to obviously help you with the revow?
We'll look into doing something with both the website and making it publicized in some way. The forms do clearly have the dates on every page in red, so that it's very obvious, but I agree with you. There's some people that do not automatically get the form, so there should be some public notification. I'll be sure that that's been done.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Ms. Barton.
There were 2 matters that were referred to in your report, Ted, that were discussed by the Law Committee. One was we went through a list of the open revaluation cases as had been requested by members of this board in the past, and we have gone through each one. Most of them, as you know, were filed in the last 2 or 3 years, even though they're listed as being cases relating to the 2005 reval, which of course is correct, they are. But they have not been pending long, and they are being handled in the ordinary course. There are a few cases that are older, and we reviewed with the law department the individual reasons why 2 or 3 of those remain pending. And the law committee is satisfied if there are members of this board that have questions about that, we'd be happy to address them individually. But we're satisfied that the cases are being managed by the assessor's office and the law department in the ordinary course, and there is not an undue lag in resolving them. The second issue that you address in your report is the proposed Connecticut legislation concerning municipal assessors. We reviewed that with the law department also, and have been advised that the proposed legislation as drafted does not affect the town of Greenwich because of our charter provisions. And so our recommendation has been that we do nothing at this time but continue to monitor the situation going forward. If the language changes and there's a need to take action, then we would, of course, bring that back to the board.
Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Raymer and then Mr. Simon.
Mr. Wharton, page 3 of paragraph 8, the last sentence of paragraph 8 says that upon request, the appraisal staff is assisting the Board of Appeals with appeal reviews. Might I ask what that consists of? I had thought this appeal process was a public process, and I'm concerned that there's a process that takes place in a non-public way in which the appeals board is discussing appraisals with the appraisal staff without the appellant being present or being privy to what's being said.
There's certain mechanics. For example, the board may feel that a property has been overclassified as maybe a S4 category and it should be an S3 category. So the only way that they can know what the impact of making that decision would be to ask the appraiser. They would say what would be the change if we changed either a land influence factor, a building characteristic factor, or some other factor. So those routinely they ask the assessors those questions. The second thing is that sometimes the person claims that there are only 3 rather than 5 bathrooms, and the board member would like to have an inspection and account of the bathrooms made. So that would require an appraiser to go out and physically make an inspection. Those are the kinds of questions that come up.
And those questions are discussed out of the purview of the appellant. The appellant basically makes their case. It's then a matter of the judgment of the board members to make a judgment. And in making a judgment, they may want to consider several factors to find out what the result would be. And the only way of their doing that would be to raise some questions. And that would be after the appellant has made their case. Making their case is one thing. The appellant may argue that the property has been classified too high, and they may have sold the board member on that, but the board member doesn't know, but dropping it one class, what that's going to mean in terms of dollars. So he can't tell the appellant right that moment that we're going to reduce your assessment by $500,000. He has to have that figure calculated for him. Yeah, I for one am expressing concern to you that it's a public hearing, and the appellant at a public hearing presents his case publicly, and then there seems to be, according to this last sentence, another facet of the hearing that takes place in a non-public way, in which the appellant doesn't have an opportunity to audit or know what's happening. It's happening in a non-public way. The Board of Appeals is an impartial, arbitrary board between 2 litigants, and yet there seems to be a private conversation between one of those litigants and the independent board, to which the other litigant is not privy. And that may be a source of concern. It might be something that you should be doing with the town attorney's office as far as your policy going forward with this.
What I would like to say is that there has been over time just arbitrary decisions made saying take $100,000 off the assessment, period. The person knows right there what it is. There's other times where the person has argued that there should be a greater adjustment made in some factor. And oftentimes the appellant has no idea what that means in terms of dollars. So they've only made the argument that it's been overclassified and says, I want you to have this reclassified at a different rate. It's impossible for the appellant to come up with the exact number. It's impossible for the board member to come up with the exact number. And they may ask then that a calculation be made and given to them. They would then discuss it at their meeting and make a decision based upon the facts that they want to have brought forward. I think both the appellant and the board members are making independent decisions. I don't think that we ever see the appraisers coming in, making arguments saying that they disagree or whatever. They're rather giving factual information based upon the request of the Board of Assessment Appeal members.
We'll move on. Mr. Kelly.
Could I just suggest that this issue that has been brought up by Mr. Raymer be referred to the BET members who are liaison with the assessor's office? And I don't think it's helpful to discuss it here at this time.
I have nothing further
I
on
think
this
that's a
point.
good suggestion. Mr. Finger and then Mr. Simon.
I was going to say the same thing that Mr. Kelly. I think this is something that should probably be referred to maybe the law committee as well as the reval committee. I think to debate legal issues between the board and Ted, I don't think is appropriate, nor maybe is the assessor properly equipped to have that kind of argument.
Ms. Barton is on both, so that's perfect.
That's what I just whispered to Jim. We, or you and I, or whoever,
We'll figure it
will
out.
address
Thank
the
you,
issue
gentlemen,
going
both.
forward.
Mr. Simon.
On paragraph 1, under number 1, it says there's a backlog of 1,094 building permits. But how many months does that represent? How many building permits do we have a month?
We have about 90 to 100. However, many of those are carried over for unfinished from the prior year. It's not an insurmountable number, and we have taken some action to have resources available to assist on going out and taking the information on this new construction. It's not something that is going to be detrimental, since we have jumped on it and we're dealing with it at this point. I'm merely pointing out that with the reval, the two appraisers in the residential section have a lot of additional work with the reval, and they have not been able to devote the normal time that they do in January, February, and March to work on permits.
Well, from my point of view, it would be helpful to say we normally have a 2-month backlog of 180 permits. I've allowed this to grow to 9 months. But you must have done all the permits prior to October 1st in order to do the grand list. So the most you can have is a 5.5-month backlog.
Plus completions of old permits. Permits that were not completed on October 1st.
Right, but you were current as of October 1st.
Yes.
The second point is under number 12. So I've read all the material here. Are we planning to transfer this contract to another vendor? Is this what's happening? With the same price? Without competitive bidding? Without anybody? What was the process by which, first, is this going to happen?
This will be taken up in the April meeting. Ms. Barton and I have met with the assessor on this. The law department is reviewing a contract, and it will all be explained before the contract is executed, which will be at the approval of the BET at its April meeting.
And who will have done reference checks?
It's a little bit more complicated than that, or actually simpler than that, and both, all at the same time. It's think of it as a name change. The personnel is remaining the same, and this is what I would call is a legal change that will not affect what we're doing or who we're currently contracting with in terms of personnel.
Mr. Chairman? I think the important part of this is, though, that we agreed that the proposed assignment or new contract with the revaluation company, which is basically the same people doing business under a different name, needed to be reviewed formally by the law committee, by the liaisons with the assessor, and then ultimately brought to this board, which presumably will happen in April. And that's the track that we're on. We will do what we can in the meantime to communicate with everyone what the relevant considerations are, but I think everyone, Ted and the rest of us, understand what has to be done in terms of approval.
Yeah, but my concerns are different than that. One, that this company actually has enough financial resources
That's
to
among the
execute
issues.
the revaluation.
Yep. One of the requirements of the proposed contract is that the new contractor provide the relevant bonds, financial statements, et cetera. We've just received a draft of a contract this afternoon. I will admit I haven't read it yet, but I expect to shortly. But those kinds of issues are the ones that we are very carefully focused on, and Steve and I and the liaisons on the revaluation, Leslie and Bill, will take this up with Ted offline and report back.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I don't know that we require bonds. If they're a new company, they
there's a
may not have
performance
financial.
bond.
Sure, there's a
There's a
performance bond
performance
element to this,
bond.
and we're going to make sure that that's one of the elements. for
It'd
that.
be really surprising to see them get a bond if they're just forming this company, right?
No.
No.
They've been in business for a number of years. Actually, it was the same company that did the revaluation for 2005, but at that time it was called Commercial Valuation. And the new company is now called Municipal Valuation Services.
So then I'm confused. Well, how is it then the same personnel
It's the same people
that
that
are
were,
working on it today?
it's the same people that have been working on it. They were the same ones that were working on it in 2005. And they've been working on it since the revaluation contract was signed.
I'm delegating
We'll
my
continue.
question to the appropriate board people.
Very well. I said it was more complex and yet
And yet more simple.
more simple. So you'll see this in April, and we'll take it up at that point. Further questions for the assessor? Is there a motion to approve the assessor's report?
I see.
Ms. Tarkington? Second, Mr. Pellegrino. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? 12-0-0. Thank you. Before we jump into the BET committees, let me just remind the BET, it is 6:32 now. We do have our budget meeting starting at 7 because that is a published meeting. What I will do is if this meeting runs over, we will adjourn this meeting. We will then go into the budget meeting starting at 7, and then we will return to this meeting. So
Great.
to the extent brevity can be considered, I suggest that you take that into consideration. Item 4 now comes before us, BET committees and special project team reports. Let me just say, this is the last month that we will be sort of listing these items on an ad hoc basis. We will come up with a structured list, and then as written reports are submitted, the agenda will just simply have a check mark next to those that have written submissions. That being said, thank you for everyone who has put in the written submission, and I will open up to the floor. I believe, Mr. Norton, you have a comment on yours?
Yes, I'd like to make a request to the fellow members of this board. Under the Investment Advisory Report, as you know, the OPEB Trust has three board members, and one whose term will expire at the end of June 30th. And I'm asking for suggestions from the BET for the OPEB Trust Board to be vetted by the Investment Advisory Committee, whose next meeting is scheduled for April 15th. We've had one candidate name submitted. I've also asked for the Selectmen Nominating Advisory Committee to suggest names, and I was told today that there are 6 possibilities. And I've also contacted the Board of Selectmen, and also I'm asking the BET if they have anybody they would suggest to fill the vacancy that will appear July 1st to do so. Thank you.
So before, what date again? Just so
April
it's clear.
15th is our next committee meeting
Okay.
at 8 o'clock. I don't think we have a room yet for that, but in this building.
Or anybody who's listening to this via Channel 79, if they're interested in this,
Exactly.
they should contact you or the Finance Department
The
before
OPEB Trust.
April 15th.
There are 2 current members and whose terms expire both next year and the following year, and one whose term expires on June 30th of this year.
Very well, thank you. Other comments or questions? Mr. Kelly?
I would just like the minutes to reflect that there's a report from the Music, Instructional Space, and Auditorium Building Committee because our meeting was held on March 16th, and the report was submitted, and I believe everybody has a copy of it.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. On that report, at the end of the report, it talks about obtaining preliminary site plan approval and MI status.
Yes.
Do you have any sense, without guessing, as to when that might be, or have there been sort of favorable meetings?
Yeah, there's been favorable meetings this week, as a matter of fact, with inland wetlands is March 22nd, but there's been favorable meetings with the engineering department, the fire marshal has been met with. So it's been progressing rather well, with planning and zoning scheduled for April 6th, and that's when we would hope to get MI status and preliminary site plan approval. Once that is obtained, we then go to ARC and ZBA for the variances, and then you would go back to P&Z for the final approval. So that's the time frame. You know, no. The answer is no. We're ever hopeful.
Okay. And just so it's clear that there are 2 variances that are needed, or 3?
There are 3 issues. I'm not sure if a variance is needed for each. There's the parking, there's the height, and there's the FAR.
Density.
The FAR is already exceeded by the existing building. The height is the height of the auditorium needed for the acoustics. And the parking, I don't know that one is needed because the parking is basically staying neutral or gaining a few spots. So.
Thank you.
That's the situation.
Mr. Pellegrino?
Yeah, for the record, I'd also like to say that I did submit, unfortunately today, Nathaniel Witherall Building Committee report, which was circulated by email, and I do have hard copies of it for everyone this evening.
So I was not the last one to get reported.
No,
Let the record reflect,
I will take
Mr.
that
Kelly
one.
was not the last one to submit his report.
That should be noted in the minute. Thank you, Mr. Pellegrino.
Further comments or questions? I did have a chance to have separate conversations with the 2 members of the revaluation team. And, you know, obviously, leading up to the budget for us, our heavy lifting really, for the most part, is done tonight. And then we sort of take a breath, although we have to then shepherd the process through the RTM. But it's my hope that next month, not only will we be taking up the contract with the assessor, but I think I want to dive a little bit deeper into the revaluation, where we are, and have a discussion about that. So that'll be for next month. So we'll take that up. Okay, next up, item 5 on our agenda, the comptroller's report.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, BET members. I'd like to turn your attention to page 2 at the top and talk about the shared services RFP. As I stated last month, there was 2 respondents, and we picked Matrix. And what I did, I handed out 2 sets of documents. The Avon report is the work product of Matrix. That was the only town in Connecticut we found that had a similar report done. It's informational only, not to be discussed tonight. And I stuffed inside the cover a scope of the work to be done by Matrix as far as the shared services project is going to develop. The shared services project is in the law department, and it's going to be out any day now. And I'll need direction from the chairman as to which BET members you would want to assign. I think you may have assigned them, or as far as proceeding with the shared services RFP. As consultants or overseers? No?
Mr.
I think there was an
Campbell,
assignment.
Help me out.
I don't think we did.
You did, here's your page.
Well, okay, what we did, yes, originally to help form a committee to help select.
Which is done.
Which is done. But what we've done since then is try to shepherd things through committees as opposed to independent teams.
Maybe it's on the first page.
So let me
You don't have to answer that tonight. It's just that it's almost ready, but I'd like to
We see,
move
we
it.
know who really, who's in charge here, I get it. No, listen, it's either gonna be assigned to a committee, a standing committee, or it'll go back to the same individuals, Mr. Norton and Mr. Raymer,
Yes.
who helped select the individuals. Oh, we did put it under the budget committee. So we could talk about that
okay.
and then figure out if that's the most appropriate place for it to be.
And then I'll answer any other questions in the controller's report.
Mr. Norton?
On the risk management, Peter, would you address who is the acting risk manager and the status of the risk manager?
The risk manager was terminated 2 Fridays ago. I am the risk manager, not acting.
Okay. That's all.
Thank you. Further comment? Is there a motion to approve the comptroller's report?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Pellegrino. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? 12-0-0. Thank you. The treasurer's report now comes before us. Questions? Moved by Mr. Simon,
Second.
second by Mr. Norton. Discussion?
Question.
Ms. Tarkington?
I noted here under Nathaniel Witherall, the ending balance of 244,000. That looks like only 4 days of cash, and so I just note that as being a very low interim balance. Just a comment. I see Roland nodding his head yes. I don't know whether that makes a good joke.
It's
but-
timing. There's a backlog. There's approximately $5.4 million in fringe benefits that the Nathaniel Witherall has to pay the general fund. They probably just took as much as they could out of there without completely wiping it out. The general fund is paying the bills, correct, Roland? And they're getting reimbursed on the payroll and the vendor checks, but there's still the $5.4 million that has to be repaid in fringe benefits. So that number could have been higher. It's the amount that the treasurer decided to take from the Nathaniel Witherall.
Thank you.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? 12-0-0. Item 7 now comes before us. Approval of BET meeting minutes for February 16th, 2010. Moved by Mr. Simon, second by Mr. Pellegrino. Discussion?
Yeah, I just would like to make a comment, having heard Mr. Pellegrino's and Mr. Kelly's comments. There was a Nathaniel Witherall report that was circulated to the members on the day of the meeting also.
With that amendment, can we adopt that unanimously?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. All those in favor of the minutes
Aye.
signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? 12-0-0. Officers' report. I will be brief. There were 2 items that were brought to my attention, and so I'm bringing it to your attention if you're interested. First, there's a Storms to Sewers, a program on Connecticut's new programs for clean rivers, open beaches, and a healthy Long Island Sound. Wednesday, March 31st at the Bruce Museum, 7 to 8:30 p.m. And it says RSVP suggested but not required, and it's co-sponsored by the Town of Greenwich Conservation and Planning and Zoning Commissions and the Bruce Museum. So that's one. The other issue, this was provided to me by the First Selectman. There is a 2010 Public Finance Outlook Conference featuring the Short-Term Investment Fund 15th Annual Investor Meeting and the Municipal Employees Retirement Fund Update. It's in East Hartford, Connecticut on Friday, March 26th starting at 8:15 is registration. There is a $90 per person. Oh, government officials and government employees. I'm not sure. Do we qualify? If you're interested, I have I either have the email I can give you or or a hard copy. I'm not, for this past month, I've just been helping shepherd the budget through. I can't even probably recall for you every meeting or every phone call, certainly not every phone call. I do thank all of the BET members for their communication. I think it's been wonderful over the past month, especially with the Budget Committee and voicing your opinions early, and I think that's been helpful for the process. So, thank you. One question, and I guess let me just take sort of a straw poll. Last year, the BET did meet with RTM districts in March for the first time ever. Obviously, the March RTM agenda was packed this year, and so it was inappropriate for us to also go and meet with them. Is there any feeling as to whether or not we should attend in April to give an overview of the budget, and then also in May? Clearly in May, the expectation is there's 12 of us, there's 12 districts. You get the picture. But is there any feeling that we should also go around in April and discuss the budget? Ms. Tarkington?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. The chairman of RTM District 7 asked if we would please repeat what we did last year. Obviously, it would be in April, because they found it most useful to have the initial session and then the May session also.
Thank you. Mr. Finger?
Yes, I think it was very helpful and well received. I had several comments from RTM members, not only the district that I attended, but other members of other districts who commented to me that they appreciated the fact that the BET was making an additional effort to come and brief them, answer questions before we, do our normal May visits with the different districts.
Mr. Simon?
I concur. And I'd like to, we're going to have our little sign-up sheet for April and May soon.
We'll have the sign-up sheet, April, May. Mr. Chairman, I believe our District 11 also found it beneficial. Okay, very well. So we'll do that. To the extent you cannot make it, we'll just try to rearrange. And obviously, I know people have business commitments as well. I think last year Mr. Crumick was on trial or something. Once again.
These would be what dates in April? These are the 5th, 6th, 7th,
Can you
and 8th?
circulate something
I'll circulate
to us?
something. We'll move
Thank
on.
you.
Thank you. Old business. Mr. Creary, I know we had you down for a presentation. We were going to do tonight a short presentation by the town administrator on City View, and then a more formalized presentation next month, assuming that was before the storm. So we'll talk about that. If anybody has any real desire to hear Mr. Creary speak tonight on it.
I think you could rephrase that.
If not,
I prepared all week.
if not, I'd like to move on, and we'll just hear the presentation next week. Thank you.
Stormed yourself.
You are. You've been sitting here all night.
Thank you.
waiting for this.
New business. Retirement System, Town of Greenwich Actuarial Review and Analysis, July 1st, 2009.
I move that.
Mr. Simon moved. Second? Second, Mr. Pellegrino. Discussion. Yes, I just want to point, I want to point out that there were two typos in the report. The first one occurs on page 3 of the executive summary. At the bottom paragraph, the second to last line, the sentence starts with the actuarial value red line and actuarial value blue bar. The second actuarial value should have actually been market value, not actuarial value. The second typo is on page 4, same section, and it has to do with the funded ratio. The paragraph funded ratio, the next to last sentence says the AVA ratio is currently lower than the MVA ratio. That's an error. The AVA ratio is currently higher than the MVA ratio, and of course, that's actuarial valuation versus market value. This has been discussed with Greg Stump, the actuary? Actuary, thank you.
And he's going to reissue a corrected report.
That was not discussed. He did correct that.
He should reissue an electronically corrected report.
We'd also should just make sure that the retirement board has those corrections and Mr. Ulasky.
I spoke with Mr. Lavin, and he does have, in fact, the issues was brought to his attention by Mr.
Okay.
Pellegrino. He does have the corrections.
Very good. Other discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention? 12-0-0. The next item. Here is what I would ask for a motion on this. The assessor and the comptroller's evaluations have been worked on by both Ms. Barton and myself. They originated with self-evaluations from the two gentlemen. They have been circulated. We have received some comment. My understanding is that as a result of the storm, some members of this committee have not even seen them due to lack of either power and or cable. I would prefer not to wait another month, and so I would ask for a motion, if there's agreement to this, that the assessors and comptrollers' evaluations be approved, subject to the comment and the final review by Ms. Barton and myself. And that way, that gives us the authority to take your comments, combine them, work with them, and then be able to have our discussions with both gentlemen and have this resolved before our next meeting. And if there's someone who agrees with that, if someone can make that motion, and then we can discuss it.
I'll make that motion.
Mr. Raymer, second by Ms. Tarkington. Discussion? So just to give a deadline, why don't we say, assuming all power is up to everyone, at least at this body, let's say by next Friday. Any other comments? That gives a whole nother week, a whole nother weekend. If you don't give your comments, we'll assume you don't have any, and we'll then get the evaluations out. All right, so next Friday. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Thank you. Review and approval of other post-employment benefits trust board resolutions for investment guidelines.
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Norton.
I'll speak on that.
Second by Mr. Pellegrino. Mr. Norton.
There were four, actually going back to the recommendation made from the OPEB Trust Board, which made some recommendations at the February 9th meeting. The Investment Advisory Committee has met, and we are recommending 4 changes to the investment guidelines for OPEB trusts. They're in sections of Roman numeral 2, 3, 4, and 5. In Roman numeral 2, we have substantially, actually there were 2 paragraphs, the second paragraph has been deleted. On the credit restrictions, which is Roman numeral number 3, we have lowered the investment grade rating to BBB-, which is the lowest investment grade rating. Item 4, the language has been changed. The portfolio can be, as opposed to maybe, managed on a discretionary basis. And the 4th change involves the performance benchmark, which is the Barclays Capital U.S. Aggregate Bond Index. To be able to satisfy that index, that's the reason for the changes in both Roman numeral 3 and Roman numeral 4, because this is a passively managed fund, and this is the reason for these subsequent changes. On behalf of the Investment Advisory Committee, I'm moving.
Further discussion. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? 12-0-0. The next item comes before us, resolution concerning cash management.
So moved.
Second?
Moved by Mr. Norton. Was that you, Mr. Finger?
Yep.
Second by Mr. Finger.
Again, on behalf of the Investment Advisory Committee, what we're doing is we're correcting some language in here, deleting banks that have gone out of existence, correcting the name of Bank of New York Mellon Corporation, and adding Wells Fargo under the banks. We've also deleted, made some changes on the second page involving the same issues, deleting banks, actually making a change. It's now TD Bank as opposed to TD Bank North. And we've also deleted reference to U.S. Trust, which is another entity that's gone out of existence. This is basically clerical to correct the listing of institutions for which we will do business.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Finger.
Just note a typo on the first line. The BET Investment Advisory Committee met on February 22nd, 2010. It's supposed to 2008.
Thank you.
I handed out the corrected version in front of you, so you can rip up the copy that has 08. And there is in your handouts.
Yeah, it's right here, Bill.
Okay.
Are you going to keep going?
Maybe I didn't see.
Do you have more comments? I have a question.
Mr. Simon.
So I was unable to understand the 4th for the result on page 2, what this actually means in English. The one that begins that the treasurer may, with the approval of the controller, invest money not to exceed 25% over a 60-day period. What is the 60-day period referred to?
When this resolve was put together, the treasurer had 6 or 7 or 8 options to invest in. She's down to 5. With Columbia Management out, there'll be 4. But what it says is, in the case of the 5 with Columbia Management, she cannot maintain, she can't be in compliance with this every day. For example, if she's got 4 options and she's got $10 million in each one, they're 25% each. As soon as she withdraws money from one of them, she goes out of compliance. So the treasurer needs the ability to rebalance within a 60-day period. That's what the intent of this resolve is.
So this should say invest money not to exceed 25% of the town total operating funds.
Over a rolling 60-day period. However, this is going to become obsolete as soon as Columbia Management's gone, because she'll only have 4 options and she'll always be out of balance. So
This has nothing to do with OPEB, right? This is the town operating funds we're talking about, right?
Correct.
yes, correct, yes.
I mean, this is a non-understandable paragraph. We want it right above, on page 2, right above these names of these banks. This is not written in English. This is written in English words. Do you understand?
I think it's the breaking out the 60-day period, if it were put in another place.
Well, that would
it
help.
would
I
flop.
couldn't understand.
It would flop.
And where would you put it?
Is there any reason why we have to approve this tonight as opposed to sending it back so that as we're not wordsmithing it tonight?
No.
I have no objection.
Is there any objection to just doing that? No.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll refer this back. It's 6:56. All right, well, fine, fair enough. I'll fix that in a second. Approval of the Human Resources Committee resolution. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Campbell, second by Mr. Pellegrino. Mr. Campbell, a 2-second on what we're doing here?
See if I fare any better with these. The Human Resources Committee met 2 months ago. Both of these resolutions have to do with contributions to the defined contribution retirement plans for both MC employees and for elected officials. We have 2 separate resolutions. The first one has to do with the issue of a front-loading of contributions. Under the current arrangement, an employee could front-load his or her contributions in the first quarter or the first half of the year, and if that employee then left, they would receive possibly an entire year's match for only a quarter or a half a year. The resolution is designed to ensure that contributions and matches are made quarterly to avoid that abuse. I would propose that we vote on the first resolution separately from the second.
So the motion was moved and then seconded by, moved by Mr. Campbell, seconded by Mr. Pellegrino. The first one, all those, a discussion. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, abstention, 12-0-0.
And the second resolution has to do with the establishment of a new and separate 457 retirement plan for those MC employees and elected officials who were hired post-September 2006. They do not enjoy the defined pension benefit that those MC employees have who were hired prior to that time. The Hayes study indicated that we had a real shortfall in appropriate compensation for these employees and recommended a 2 to 4% plan be put into effect. This resolution would provide for a 3% plan. Matching basis the same way that the 401k plan matches right now for those hired prior to September 1, 2006. And so I move this second resolution.
It's been moved by Mr. Campbell, second by Mr. Pellegrino. Discussion. All those in favor signify
Aye.
by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, abstention, 12-0-0. The renewal of Blum Shapiro contract for fiscal year ending June 30th, 2010 audit.
Mr. Chairman, on behalf of the Audit Committee, I'm recommending that we engage Bloom Shapiro to perform the financial audit for the year ending June 30, 2010.
Moved by Mr. Norton.
Seconded.
Second by Mr. Pellegrino. Discussion. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, abstention. There's one hiccup. Part of the packet, you should have received the OPEB Trust Board recommendation, Board of Investment Taxation Investment Advisory Committee
resolution for OPEB Trust Board Investment Guidelines, which is a separate document from the document that we approved a few minutes ago, which was the resolution concerning investment guidelines for the OPEB Trust. First, is there a motion to take this matter up?
I'd like to make this motion.
Mr. Pellegrino, is there a second? Second by Mr. Mason. Is there discussion?
What is it?
This document.
That document, I thought we approved that document last month.
It was in the package this month, and it was not approved, because we did not have the guidelines in place to approve it. Right.
Okay.
So, all those in favor of taking this matter up signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention? Is there a motion to approve these?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Norton.
Second.
Second by Mr. Pellegrino. Mr. Simon.
The Investment Advisory Committee has already accepted those, and in effect, we've already approved them a few minutes ago.
Can I address this question, Mr. Pellegrino?
Sure. This is essentially the resolution that was made by the OPEB Trust Board, reviewed by the Investment Advisory Committee, and essentially allows the treasurer to move 100% of the fixed income, which is currently managed in a separate account by Columbia Asset Management, allows her to move it to Vanguard's Total Bond Market Index Fund. This is in conforming with the guideline changes that we just passed. So this is essentially the mechanics of doing it.
Further discussion?
I think the real question is whether we delegated this to the investment committee or not, but apparently not.
I don't think we did. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions 12-0-0. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Yes.